Hello, everyone. Today we're going to be looking at a screencast lecture that is going to be based on the beginnings of the civil rights movement in the United States in the 1950s. And we're going to cover a couple of topics on this section, but I'm also leaving a video for you to watch that covers a number of key events, and then you're going to have a mini document-based question assignment that I've posted in this week's folder as well. But I wanted to give you a few background ideas so you could see kind of the basic um, beginnings of the movement and some of the principles that the movement was being based on. So to begin with, I wanted to jump back to some previous American history in order to get to some of the foundational issues in the civil rights movement. And the first of these issues is the concept of separate but equal. This principle that was so important to um, be used by the US government and many states, especially the southern states in the United States, to justify reasons for racial discrimination. And the story with this particular principle, we have to go back a little bit farther into American history. So I've got a little bit of a bolded point in piece of information about an 1896 Supreme Court case. But before we talk about that a little bit, I want to go back even a little bit farther. Because if you think about the basis of the civil rights movement, let's go back in earlier American history to the time of the American Civil War. And if you look at the American Civil War, there were three constitutional amendments added to the U.S. Constitution at the end of that war. One, the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. Two, the 14th Amendment, which dealt with the protection of citizenship or extending citizenship to um, people who had formerly been enslaved. And the third one is the 15th Amendment, which guaranteed voting rights for people who had formerly been enslaved. And so we'll come back to at least one of those amendments here just a little bit. But if you think about it, by the time period after the end of the Civil War, the United States had already made some of the guarantees that the civil rights movement was fighting so hard to try to achieve. Citizenship and the protection of citizen rights of all citizens on the 14th Amendment, and then the 15th Amendment, which was the protection of the right to vote. But between the American Civil War and the civil rights movement, of course, many things had happened in the United States that had continually stripped the rights of African American citizens specifically away. And one of the key kind of turning points in an interpretation of the US Constitution takes place in 1896 with the Supreme Court case of Plessy versus Ferguson. In this particular case, there was a lawsuit that was filed by a mixed race man who had been asked to ride in segregated railroad cars. And this man pursued the case all the way to the Supreme Court. And in that particular case, it was determined that the acceptability of having separate railroad cars was constitutional under the interpretation of the US Constitution, as long as the railroad cars were equal in nature. And that principle of separate but equal became a driving force in the United States to extend the issues of segregated facilities. And so from 1896 all the way up to the modern civil rights movement, that had been the principle that the United States had pretty much functioned on. And along with that principle of separate but equal facilities, you have the continuation or implementation and continuation of all sorts of series of laws that are collectively called Jim Crow laws that allowed and encouraged segregation throughout the country. We think about it specifically within the southern states, but really it was all across the country. Many states had segregationist laws in place. All of it based on the principle that was the interpretation from 1896 that you could separate and segregate as long as the facilities were equal in nature. All this collectively falls under the labeling of Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow, by the way, if you want to wonder why it has that name to it, Jim Crow was a character that was from um, long running traveling shows that took place in the United States. They were called minstrel shows. And in these minstrel shows, there was a character known as Jim Crow. And in the minstrel shows, a lot of the entertainment that took place, they were kind of like traveling variety shows, were used to make fun of people who were black. And one of the characters in those shows was a character named Jim Crow. So that's why the name became applied, which, by the way, is also why the idea of wearing blackface is always inappropriate, because in those minstrel shows you had white actors that were wearing blackface to make fun of African Americans, which that's where the connection to that all comes from. But regardless, the legality of separate but equal was questioned in many different ways. And in particular, one of the ways it's questioned is by one of the constitutional amendments that I mentioned earlier on, the 14th Amendment. And the 14th Amendment was passed at the end of, or right after the Civil War, in an attempt to try to guarantee that former enslaved people, former black slaves, were not being discriminated against in the southern states where they now were supposed to be equally treated as equal citizens. And the 14th Amendment is a key component of understanding the civil rights movement. So let's take a look at that actually just a little bit here. I've got the section of the 14th Amendment that is significant for us to think about. So look at the phrasing here. I'll just kind of read it out loud as you look at it too. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. The 14th Amendment becomes one of the key components of the struggle of the civil rights movement. Basically, if you look at it, it seems pretty straightforward that the states could not create a law which would take rights away from citizens or create laws that would limit the rights of some citizens as opposed to the rights of the others. And this became one of the main arguments that civil rights lawyers used. And this is also, of course, one of the main civil rights arguments today. This would be the same kind of interpretation that would have been used when the struggle to protect the rights to gay marriage would have taken place, basically saying that a state could not restrict the rights of its citizens to become married and allow marriages by other citizens to take place, which would potentially limit the rights that their citizens had. So, one of the main events that takes place in the civil rights movement. And in fact, this is the event and the court case, which, by the way, overwhelmingly legal historians have said this is the most important court case of the 20th century, Supreme Court case of the 20th century. And it's the court case that, of course, directly relates to our town, the city of Topeka, because it's the Brown versus Board of Education case. And hopefully you're familiar with the story of the Brown family. But basically, the story in a nutshell is that their daughter, Linda Brown, was a 7-year-old elementary school student, and the neighborhood where the Brown family lived was right across the street from this school, which is the Sumner School. This is down close to like where Ward Mead Park is, or what they call like Old Prairie Town, if you know where that part of town is down on it'd be on the west side of Topeka Boulevard, kind of close down to like where the interstate runs down there. But in this particular situation, this school in the city of Topeka was one of the designated white schools. And the Brown family lived right by it, but the closest school that was designated for use for non-white families would have been the Monroe School, which is, if you went down Topeka Boulevard and or would get off on the Adams Street exit, it's down where you go past the Judicial Center, and it's on the east side of Topeka Boulevard, down a little bit farther. And in this case, the reason, well, there's multiple reasons why the civil rights lawyers chose to pursue this case about the Brown family. But one of the main cases is the fact that here in Kansas, segregation of schools was allowed, but it was not required, unlike when you look at a lot of the southern states where segregation was required by law. And so they had a case then that they could work in with other cases, and you can see it involved cases from all different parts of the country, places where segregation was required by law, like in South Carolina, and then places like Kansas where segregation was not required by law. And also in Topeka, the grade schools were segregated, but when you went into the junior highs and to high school, which there was only Topeka High at that time, they were not segregated. Certainly clubs, organizations, sports were segregated, but classrooms were not segregated. So in the case, the Brown family was assisted by the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, who did a lot of the work with arguing civil rights cases. And they chose Thurgood Marshall to argue the court case. Thurgood Marshall is one of the most noted lawyers in American history, and I don't believe he ever lost a case before the Supreme Court, something like 30 some cases that he won, and eventually Thurgood Marshall becomes the first African American Supreme Court justice. But in the case itself, it is a dramatic decision that the Supreme Court makes. And the decision that the Supreme Court makes is that unanimously, all 9 members of the Supreme Court, which is pretty rare when you have unanimous decisions in the Supreme Court, determined that separate but equal facilities in education was unconstitutional. Now realize that this was just dealing with educational facilities, but this is what's going to kind of open the floodgates for declaring other segregated facilities, whether it be restaurants or movie theaters or any kind of public facility that a person might imagine that had segregated laws in place. This is what's really opens things up to start to get that process in place where those segregation laws would be declared unconstitutional too. But this only dealt with segregations within schools. The Supreme Court ruled that the schools should begin desegregating. Well, their phrasing was all deliberate speed, which, the supporters of this said that means right now. And the opponents of it said, well, deliberate means that you should take your time and that you really should not, rush this type of stuff. And certainly the um, members of all the southern states' congressional delegations, nearly all, said that they were going to do everything to try to oppose this. They signed off on a document called the Southern Manifesto, which said that they would refuse to support this and resist it at all means possible. There's only three Southern congressmen that did not sign it. One of them was Lyndon Baines Johnson from Texas, who will eventually become a big civil rights supporter. He was Kennedy's vice president and becomes president after JFK's death. Another was, if you know the name, Al Gore, who was vice president under Bill Clinton and then later ran for president against George Bush and lost. It wasn't him, but it was his father, who was a congressman from Tennessee, that didn't sign it. And then the other one was a congressman from Kentucky. But only three of the entire southern states' congressional delegations refused to sign it. But this is what kind of sets things off for the beginnings of the civil rights movement. I wanted to go over this a little bit since we have such a close connection to it in our local community, and the rest of the civil rights events I'm going to hold you to looking at in your textbook reading. The documentary that I've included in this folder called the documentary is called Time for Justice, and then you have some civil rights related documents that you're looking at on a mini DBQ. So talk to you later. Goodbye.